What we're going to open up tonight is a mystery that is over 3,000 years old from the Bible. It's called the mystery of the Shemitah. It lies behind and is determining the rise and fall of the stock market, the rise and fall of our economy. It is behind the rise of nations and the fall of powers, empires, superpowers. The key to when global cataclysms come, the timing of world wars, even the atomic age, the Cold War, 9/11, the rise of America itself, and what may be the fall, the past, present, and future. In the Bible, Leviticus 25, it says, you will sow, reap for 6 years, and on the 7th year, you will rest, the land will rest. It was the Sabbath year. Just like there was a Sabbath day, every 7th day was the Sabbath day, every 7th year was the Sabbath year, and it was called the Shemitah. In that year, an entire year of rest, there was no sowing, no reaping, no plowing of the fields. There was nothing, no buying or selling of the fruits of the land. For an entire year, the purpose was to turn away from the world and turn to God. The last day is in the month of Elul, and it's the 29th day. It's called Elul 29. On that day, as the Shemitah goes to its peak, all debts are wiped out, all credits wiped out. The financial accounts of the nation are wiped clean. On the day, Elul 29, it's the day of nullification, wipe out of everything financial, and it was to be a blessing. But as Israel turned away from God and went after other gods, the Shemitah becomes, from a sign of blessing, becomes a sign of judgment. In the year 586 BC, in the days of the prophet Jeremiah, the Shemitah comes upon Israel in the form of judgment. The armies of Babylon overrun the land. The land is devastated. Jerusalem is destroyed, and the people are removed and taken captive into Babylon. And the prophet Jeremiah is told that the judgment will last 70 years because of the mystery of the Shemitah. In the law, in the Torah, it said when the judgment comes, the land will rest and will observe its Sabbaths. Then the land will rest. For all the Shemitahs, or Sabbath years, it did not rest. They broke 70 Sabbath years, or Shemitah. So now God says, you're gonna be removed from the land, from the blessings, and the land will now observe its Sabbaths. Tishri is the most holy month of the Hebrew year, of the calendar. Tishri is the year of trumpets, Yom Kippur, tabernacles. Tishri is the month that opens up the Shemitah, and it's the month that closes the Shemitah. The majority of greatest crashes in history, single day, happen all around the month of Tishri. Now that is against odds. Now for years, financial analysts have been mystified. Well, the answer's in the Bible. In the Bible, the month of Tishri is September, October, the very time that God appointed for the financial wipeout. But it gets even more stunning. And it's gonna, the phenomenon of the Shemitah has been increasing in the last 14 years. The mystery is so big that it literally affects the rise and fall of nations. Shemitah, the Hebrew word means the release, but it can also mean the shaking, the fall, the collapse. In 586 BC, when the Shemitah, the judgment of the Shemitah comes on Israel, not only is Judah, the kingdom, wiped out, but it causes Babylon to rise. And then Babylon falls and Persia rises, of course, because the 70 years are up. Even Babylon and Persia are linked to the timing of the Shemitah. So could the Shemitah be affecting world history to this day, and the rise and fall of empires or superpowers? The greatest shaking in world history up to the beginning of the 20th century was the First World War in history, the war to end all wars. 1917 is the year of the Shemitah. In that year, Shemitah means collapse. The Russian Empire collapses. Before the end of that war, the Austrian Empire will collapse, the German Empire will collapse, the Turkish Empire will collapse, collapsing of powers. The Shemitah is also about the rise of nations. In that Shemitah, it's the beginning of the rise of America as a superpower. America enters the war, becomes the head of nations. And at that time, the British Empire reaches near bankruptcy. The financial center of the world moves from Britain and the old world to America in that war. And America becomes the greatest creditor nation in the world. World history changes with a Shemitah. Fast forward. Bring us to the Shemitah of the year 1945. Another global cataclysm. World War II, the greatest cataclysm ever in world history. It reaches its peak in the year of the Shemitah. Hitler begins the seizing of Europe by seizing Austria and Czechoslovakia in the year 1938. The conflict begins. 1938 is the year of the Shemitah. The war will last 7 years, the years of the Shemitah. It will reach its crescendo with a final Shemitah, 1945. You know, the 7-year cycle of the Shemitah will end in the first week of September 1945. In that same week, the war, the Second World War, comes to its end. The day that they seal that, the day of this procession, is Elul 29, the very day of the Shemitah. And America becomes the superpower of the world in that Shemitah. A new world order begins with that Shemitah. A new financial order called Bretton Woods, where all across the world, the economies, the currencies are based on the American dollar. The Shemitah, though, also means the fall. If one goes 4 Shemitahs later, it brings us to the year 1973, just as crucial. That year, America makes a fateful decision to legalize the killing of its unborn children. That same month, in the financial realm, it collapses. That same year, Bretton Woods, the world order based on the dollar, collapses. That same year, America, the world's preeminent superpower, suffers its first defeat in modern history, if not ever, as it loses the war in Vietnam. And the day it loses the war in Vietnam is the exact same day it won the war in the Second World War. Day of its greatest victory becomes the day of its defeat. What happens if we move 4 more Shemitahs into the future? It takes us to the year 2001. As the Shemitah reaches its peak of 2001, its last week, the week that is heading to Elul 29, the week of nullification, wipeout, as it reaches its peak, comes 9/11 in that week. The Shemitah means collapse. The towers collapse. The towers representing America's preeminence collapse. There's an ancient biblical mystery connecting the rising of towers and the rise of power or nations. Well, let me share this. At the moment of America's greatest supremacy, 1945, towers over everything, a tower is conceived which is going to represent America's greatness. And that tower is called the World Trade Center. It is conceived in the year of the Shemitah. Its construction begins much later in 1966. 1966 is the year of the Shemitah. It is built for 7 years, the 7 years of the Shemitah. It is finished and opens in the year 1973. 1973 is the year of the Shemitah. And it's destroyed in the year 2001, the year of the Shemitah. The Shemitah gives a warning. The nations, what it warns is, a nation's blessing and prosperity comes from God alone. And if the nation drives God out of its life and defies and blasphemes God, those blessings cannot remain. The Shemitah is linked to the end times. I mean, look, think about the 7-year tribulation, 7 years, Shemitah. The 70 years, the 77s of Daniel, Shemitahs. But I want to share this mystery here, and that is this. When you had every 7th year was the Shemitah, Sabbath year. Every 7 Shemitahs opens up the Jubilee. During the Jubilee, prisoners are released, and most uniquely, if you lost your land on the Jubilee, it was restored to you. Whatever you lost your ancestral possession, your father's house, it was restored on the Jubilee. You came back. It says, everyone shall return to his father's possession, to your ancestral land. You see, for 2,000 years, the Jewish people were driven from their land. 2,000 years, they had no land. They lost their father's possession. But something happens. World War I. I mentioned this, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which had ruled the land of Israel for 400 years, Muslim, was not favorable to the Jewish people. In that war to end all wars, the Ottoman Turkish Empire in this year begins to collapse. The British Empire enters the Middle East, enters Jerusalem. The year is 1917, and the British Empire is marching in under the reign of General Allenby, and Jerusalem comes, and Israel for the first time comes under the British Empire, which for the first time under a power that is favorable to the Jewish people in 2,000 years. If you take that Shemitah, goes 7 Shemitahs. The 7th Shemitah begins September 1965, ends September 1966. The year of restoration would be September 1966 to September 1967. Does that sound familiar? June 7th, 1967. Israeli soldiers in the Six-Day War. Israel is surrounded, the Arab world, or much of it says we're going to destroy them and drive them into the sea. The Six-Day War happens miraculously. Israeli soldiers enter through the Lion's Gate, and Jerusalem, for the first time, is restored to the Jewish people in 2,000 years. When did it take place? It took place in the exact time period, the year following the 7th Shemitah. I mean, here they are. Here you have the 2 restorations of the land, and they are, one is 1917, one is 1967, 50 years, Jubilee. The Lord said, I will not return until you, Jerusalem, you say, Baruch haba b'Hashem Adonai. Blessed is he. Until the Jewish people, they had to survive for 2,000 years for that to come true. They had to come back to Israel for that to come true. They had to come back to Jerusalem, because that's where they're going to meet him. When is the next 7th Shemitah? It brings you to this year called 2014. It begins in September 2014. It goes to September 2015. Just to be aware, if it does follow, the pattern is there is always war in the Middle East, war in Israel, but it results in a prophetic restoration. And so the sign of judgment, the Shemitah takes the sign of judgment now. The Harbinger reveals there are 2 shakings, recent shakings of America. One is 9/11, and the other is the collapse of Wall Street and our economy, the Great Recession. The first shaking takes place in the year 2001. The second takes place in the year 2008. That's a 7-year cycle. In fact, America was commemorating the 7th year of 9/11, while on Wall Street the second shaking was being set in motion right then. And it reaches its peak on the day September 29th, 2008. They enter the New York Stock Exchange and they ring the opening bell, but the opening bell that day refuses to ring. Even Wall Street took it as a sign. That day comes the greatest point magnitude crash in world history. On what day did the greatest collapse take place in world history? It took place on Elul 29, the wipeout day of the Bible, that God appointed from ancient times to strike the financial realm of a nation. You know, the Shemitah is about the number 7. Well, not only are they 7 years apart, not only do they happen in the beginning of the 7th month, but in 2001, how much is wiped out? How much percent of Wall Street? 7%. How much is wiped out in that day in 2008? 7%. How many points were wiped out in 2008, greatest crash? 777. 777. The next Shemitah has begun. So where are we now? The stock market has been rising since the collapse of the last Shemitah from 2009. Has been rising and rising. As the Shemitah began, Wall Street began to tremble and sway violently. And the peak collapse of that opening week was September 25th. September 25th was the opening day of the Shemitah. Now something else happened. For the first time, this age of America being the strongest economic power on earth came to an end. It was eclipsed by the nation of China. And this is just the beginning. America's apostasy from God is deepening, quickening, and intensifying. When Israel got its first warning strike, when the first warning strike came in 732 BC, the ones who did it were the Assyrians. And the Assyrians are noted in history as the people who invented what is called terrorism. In America, 9/11, you have a strike of terrorism. The people who do it are also from the Middle East, as the Assyrians were. The Assyrians carried out their attack on Israel in the language of Akkadian. The closest language today to Akkadian, the sister language, is Arabic. Those who brought that first attack on Israel, that warning strike, are the same ones who years later are going to be responsible for the great calamity that comes, the judgment that comes on the nation. ISIS. ISIS comes from Al-Qaeda. They're an offshoot from the same people who brought us 9/11. They come from the Middle East, of course. But ISIS, they claim, what's the land they're claiming? Syria and Iraq. Well, do you know, Syria and Iraq was the core land of the Assyrian Empire. There is even more than Al-Qaeda. They may very likely have the blood of the Assyrians in them. You want prophecy? You've got it. You want Bible days? You're in it. You want the end times? You see it. All hell has tried to wipe out the Jewish people. Do you know that? For 4,000 years, the pharaohs tried to stamp out the people of God. Assyria tried to wipe them out. Babylon tried to destroy them. Rome tried to crush them. Hitler tried to annihilate them. But they have all fallen.